Not too long ago, Nintendo teased Metroid Prime 4 at the Game Awards. Even more not too long ago, they announced that they were scrapping all of their work on it and starting over from scratch. This time with the original studio behind the first Prime. Prime, if you will. It's not cancelled, but Nintendo apparently wasn't satisfied with what they had, so they're starting over. This isn't the first time that the Prime series has had a troubled announcement, but it's respectable that Nintendo is keeping with it. Most companies, I suspect, would have just cut their losses and moved on. But Nintendo has a lot of faith in Metroid, which struck me as a bit strange given that it's never been one of their best-selling franchises. Samus? You mean Samus from Super Smash Bros? Ugh, seriously. What is it? Is it the shoulders? It's the shoulders, isn't it? One of the best series of all time, and nobody can take it seriously because Samus is rocking some football pads. It doesn't help that we haven't gotten a major Metroid on a home console in 9 years, and that was its own can of worms. So I felt inspired to go back and play Prime 1, a GameCube classic from 2002. Let's take a look. With no remake on the horizon, the obvious path was emulation, dolphin settings in the description. I'm going to be using a widescreen mod and some other enhancements, so let's see how it looks. Hey, that's pretty good. I mean, who even needs a switchboard, right? Right? I mentioned a moment ago that Prime 4 isn't the first time a game in the series had a troubled announcement. Well, the other was Prime 1. It had been the better part of a decade since the previous mainline Metroid game. Doesn't that sound familiar? Nintendo had the bright idea to toss the franchise off to some nobody studio named Retro, based out of Austin, Texas of all places. Meanwhile, people outside of the Nintendo fandom were skeptical of the GameCube in general. The console was goofy, the games were cartoony, the whole industry was going through a bit of an edgy phase. Of course, Prime came out and became the highest rated game of the series. And it was the most mature, second most mature Nintendo game of the time. And everybody's been eating their words ever since. Now I have to admit something. This is the only Metroid game I've ever played. I know, put down the torches. See, I'm from the Dark Souls Hollow Knight generation of Metroidvania fans. I mean, I was alive when Prime came out, but I didn't have much in the way of disposable income. Now when it comes to retro games, that is, old games, not the developer retro, people might often tell you that a game holds up. My philosophy has always been that if you need to talk about whether or not a game holds up, then it probably doesn't. Prime has really turned me around on that. I still think the idea has some merit. Playing any old game will take some adjustment from the player, particularly if they've never played a game from that era. Metroid Prime isn't an exception to this, but the learning curve was surprisingly easy given how whack the controls are. We'll touch back on that in a second. I need to address the fact that I just said something negative about a classic Nintendo title, and I can already see people getting their torches back out. Look, Prime hasn't aged perfectly, but it's done pretty damn well, all things considered. And for the sake of not getting a brick through my window, I'll tell you right now, I really like this game. Still, I've always been better at seeing the bad than the good, so I need to address the elephant in the room. Prime is a first-person shooter, but it released before any standard control scheme had emerged for console shooters. The stick you move with and the stick you aim with? Yeah, they're the same stick. And it's as jank as it sounds. During normal play, the main stick moves Samus forward and backward and turns her left and right. Moving Samus feels almost like driving a car. The triggers serve as modifiers. The right trigger enables free look, which is useful for examining the environment and, aiming up. But you can't move while you're doing this. No good for a firefight. Thankfully, the left trigger locks on to nearby enemies, allowing you to strafe and dodge. You don't really need to aim much thanks to the lock-on, but this isn't a twitch shooter. It's more about movement, avoiding damage rather than dealing it. But Metroid Prime isn't really even a shooter. I mean, it is, but that's just like its day job, man. Metroid's real passion is letting you explore an alien world, learning about it by scanning the environment, delving deeper with an ever-expanding arsenal of weapons and gear. You know, real Metroidvania shit. The game opens on a pirate frigate in orbit of a planet called Talon 4. In the Metroid universe, being a space pirate is a race, not a profession, and Samus has some bad blood with the space pirates. They've been using radioactive phazon to perform tests on various species, including Metroids. Predictably, this didn't go well for them, and the frigate starts, well, exploding. Samus' suit gets damaged while evacuating, the perfect contrivance to rid her of all those pesky abilities she acquired from the previous game. She finds Meta Ridley, a clone of the space pirate's presumably intelligent former leader/pet space dragon, and follows him to the world below. And that world happens to be a pretty interesting one. The prologue notwithstanding, the whole game is set on Talon 4. It consists of 5 major areas. The Talon Overworld, which is rainy and Earth-like. The Chozo Ruins, remains of an old desert civilization. The Phendrana Drifts, which are basically just the Chozo Ruins, but you should really bring a jacket. The Magmoor Caverns, the world's slowest and hottest subway ride. And the Phazon Mines, which suck. We first arrive in the Talon Overworld, and it's here that I have to point out just how good this game looks. Even without all the enhancements Dolphin is making, it's hard to believe this is an early GameCube title. The whole world looks great, but it's the attention to detail that's stellar, like the frequency of raindrops on your visor changing based on where you're looking or how fast you're moving. And if you look at a bright light, you can see Samus's eyes reflected back inside her own visor. Little things like that a lot of people might not notice, but Retro put the time in to add. Pretty much immediately after arriving on Talon, Samus makes her way out to the Chozo Ruins and the game proper begins. Prime consists mostly of moving throughout the world, finding dead ends and locked doors that can't be opened without the correct ability. Upon getting a new upgrade, you'll have to remember where you could use it to access a new area. Thankfully, most of the major roadblocks are pretty memorable, but sooner or later you're gonna get lost. This is partially because the 5 zones are split up via elevators, which are just thinly veiled loading screens. And the 3D map the game gives you isn't very explicit about where the other side of any given elevator is. By comparison to, say, Dark Souls, where with only 1 or 2 exceptions the whole world is continuously connected, Talon feels segmented. It can be hard to remember where specific locations are. But no worries, Metroid's all about exploring anyway. We'll just take our time and... Oh. Or the game could just tell you where to go. Really, unless you've got somewhere to be, I'd recommend turning the hint system off. Prime is at its best when you can explore the zone without getting pop-ups about the latest fluid pattern analysis or whatever. Some of the zones are more interesting than others. The 2 that stick out in my mind as being particularly bad are the Magmoor Caverns and the Phazon Mines. With the caverns, the issue can be seen just by looking at its map. It's just a line. The area is almost literally one-dimensional. It has a fine theme, and some of the enemies are interesting, but it was basically just used as a hallway to travel in between other areas. It's the only zone that has a connection to all 4 other zones, but it's so insubstantial by comparison. It's really weird that the caverns are the most connected, most central area when your ship is off to the side, back in the overworld. The game has no real central hub as a result. No home base that you always return to, unless you go well out of your way, and that makes it way harder to keep your bearings. Then there's the Phazon Mines, the last major zone you unlock, so it's no surprise that it's the most challenging to get through, but the difficulty curve is way steeper than I expected. I'd gotten by up until that point with just the basic power beam, bosses notwithstanding, but this is where Prime forces you to broaden your horizons, and makes you actually start using some of those missiles and beam types you've been collecting for something other than opening doors. Once you get through this gauntlet of enemies though, don't expect a break or a save point or anything. Nope, immediately into a boss fight. It isn't a hard fight, but it's got a gimmick you haven't seen before, and you'll likely be low on health and ammo, at least if you suck as bad as I do. There's finally a save point immediately after it, but it comes across as almost a bit mean-spirited. If you're gonna do the Dark Souls you must master this area before moving on thing, then do it from the start so that I know what I'm getting into. You can't just spring it on me more than halfway into the game. These are just small blemishes on an otherwise great game world. Now I'd like to talk about gear. At least a few different items. There's the weapons. the power, wave, ice, and plasma beams, which all have different effects and can open different doors. There's missiles, which pack a punch and can be used in conjunction with the beams to augment their damage output. But what interests me more than the weapons are all of the abilities that augment Samus's movement. The Morph Ball allows you to fit through small tunnels. In conjunction with the Boost Ball, she can make massive jumps out of half-pipes, or it can even be used in boss fights to quickly evade damage. The Spider Ball offers entirely new ways to move around levels, although only in specific areas. Then there's the direct suit upgrades, like the Double Jump or the Gravity Suit, which, bafflingly, allows Samus to ignore the effects of jumping underwater. The item I was most excited for was the Grapple Beam, which is unfortunately one of the last items you get, and it's sorely underused. The previous suit upgrades changed the way you thought about moving in levels, but the Grapple Beam can only be used at very specific locations. It's usually only a little faster than just jumping around, and you get it so late in the game it's kind of disappointing. In the start menu, there's a percentage attached to each save file. That represents how many items you've collected, including optional missile and health upgrades. Thankfully, scans aren't counted in this number. It plays a weirdly important role in that it has an impact on the ending of the game. And yes, this is the part of the video where I talk about spoilers, so if you're sensitive to that, skip to here. All good? Good. So the entire game has been about exploring Talon, generally ruining the space pirate's week, and above all, killing Meta Ridley. If you're paying attention to the scans, though, you'll find out about a meteor strike that happened when Talon was inhabited by Chozo. On that meteor was the game's namesake, the Metroid Prime. Samus hates Metroids almost as much as she hates space pirates, so that's gonna have to go too. She collects a bunch of artifacts, kills Ridley, and enters the impact site, which is possibly an even worse area than the Phazon mines, but thankfully it's so short you can pretty much just run through it. After killing Metroid Prime, you get an ending. There are 3 endings in total, one for less than 75% completion, where Samus hops aboard her ship and watches the carnage from a distance, one for 75 to 99% completion, which is the same as the previous ending, but you get a close-up of Samus's face, and one for 100% where you get a glimpse of the main antagonist of the sequel. Now you might be thinking it's pretty whack to have to complete the first game to 100% in order to meet the next game's antagonist, and you'd be right. I haven't finished Echoes yet, but Dark Samus really comes out of nowhere if you haven't seen this ending. So that was Metroid Prime. I wanted to note that I've been overly critical in this video. I don't want anyone who hasn't played the game to think this is bad or anything. It's great. Hopefully we'll get a remaster for Switch before Prime 4 comes out. And if not, then try and play it any way you can. Find an original copy, get the trilogy for Wii, or emulate it if you've got the hardware. Now that I've got this gem under my belt, I'm excited for Prime 4, way out in the horizon. Should be worth the wait. See you next time.